In this video, I'm going to look at the action area in a simulation recording and a few things that controls. Before we start, I'm going to be in the vertical layout view on the screen because I find that one convenient. And I've got advanced layout selected over on the property sheet so I can see all of the properties because we'll need to look into those. So I have a simple example here. I'm just going to look at one screen and I have two macros recorded within the same step. One is for a string input field and one is for a mouse click. So the action area is the area on the screen where you perform the action during recording, such as clicking on a button on the screen or entering a text in a text field. In this example, I'm going to start with this mouse click action where I clicked on this enter button. Now the action area is the bit that's highlighted here with the bounding handles on it. And that's basically the object area on the screen. Now that's what's captured during recording, and that controls three specific things. The first of these is the object image. You can see here that this image is captured to be exactly that same area of the action area there. The next thing that's captured is under documentation, we have a highlight position / size property. This is where the highlight will be drawn around the action area in the documentation. And finally, and most importantly, we have the control. The position and size property for that records exactly the same thing, and that's the area that is active during playback, and that's where the user needs to click. So all three of those things are controlled and captured automatically to be exactly the same as the action area. So if we change this on the screenshot, say I want to resize this and I'll make it extra big just so you can see what I'm talking about. If I change the action area here, you can already see that it's changed this object image for me. That now includes the whole of the action area. And again, if I go down to documentation, I can see that the highlight is now 91 pixels high. So that's changed as well. And the control, similarly, the height of that has changed. So whenever you change anything directly on the screenshot here, this is going to affect all three of those things. Now, what if you want to change one of those independently? Firstly, let me put this back to where it was so it's a bit more realistic. So say I want to change this object image because I think there's too much white space around there, and if I have text flowing on either sides of this, it kind of looks ugly. So say I want to crop that right down. The easiest way of doing this is to use the Update Object Image button, which is on the top of the properties sheet. If I click on that, I get the whole screenshot here, and I can adjust it by dragging the boundaries here. Let me pull it into halfway, which isn't what we want, but you can see what I'm doing then. If I move that, you can now see that this image has changed to be exactly where I put it to, but the action area still remains the same. That's not been changed. And the highlight position still shows 22 pixels by 22 pixels, and the control position and size also shows 22 by 22 pixels for the size of that area. So you can see that if I change it in here in the properties sheet, it's not going to affect everything else. Now that doesn't look particularly good, so I'm going to undo that and show you another way of doing the same thing. Under the object image, we have the replace image button here. If you click on that, there's crop image is one of the options, along with all of the usual ones. If I select that, I get only the action area here, or the current image area actually, and I can effectively do the same thing, changing the size here. It's a bit small, so I'm going to zoom it up. For some reason, recently in one of the releases, you end up with this black dot in the corner for some reason. I don't know where it comes from, but it's not actually part of the image, so you can just ignore it. If you leave it in there, it's not actually going to appear. But what I do want to do here is I want to crop this image all the way down. So I'm just going to drag these borders here and save that. And now that image has been cropped all the way down. It's going to look a bit nicer. And again, the action area hasn't been affected. So let's go look at the next thing now, the documentation highlight. To show you what that looks like and what it means, actually I'll take the other field in here, or the other macro. I'm going to look at the string input macro. Say here we've got the action area, which is where they clicked, which is the transaction code field if you're familiar with the SAP. And it doesn't include this drop down here on the end, which kind of is correct really in playback. But in the documentation, I'd rather include the whole thing. So I want to drag that over to include the whole thing here. Again, if I drag it here, it's going to affect everything, which I don't want it to do. Handily, there's a similar thing to changing the object image on the top here, which is document highlight. I select that and I get a very similar box as we just saw with the object image, and I can change this now to include that whole area. And again, it has now changed only the highlight position and size. You can see this is now 140 pixels wide versus the control area is actually only 123. So, and again, it's not changed the control, it's not changed the action area, it's only changed what will appear in the documentation. And if we go and generate that document, we'll see what happens now. So you can see now that the action area, the highlight in the documentation does include the whole of that area there, all the way including that drop down. Now there's a few other things I don't really like in here. I don't like the fact that these don't really line up. It just looks a little bit ugly there. So I'm going to show you another way that we can adjust the documentation highlights to fix that. I'm going to close this document because I want to regenerate it, and if you regenerate it and it's still open, it's going to fail. So the other place I can change this, apart from obviously I can just overtype values in here, or I can use the edit button here and I can individually type them in if I don't know what order they come in. But you can also go to documentation view, and then you can see exactly where they are, and you can see because I've got two macros in this one step, they're both layered over the same screenshot. And here, exactly as before, I'm going to zoom in a bit. I can adjust these to be exactly where I want to. So this one I'm going to drag down, so I need to select it first. Drag this down so it's the same size as the other one. And if I want to put a bit more space between them, I can do that as well. So I can make all of these adjustments in the documentation view, and again, they're not going to affect anything else. And when I regenerate that document, you can see now that it's been adjusted. There's more space in the middle here, and they line up, or they're sized to be consistent. Okay, so that's the main things with that. I'm going to go back to the demo mode view and show you one last thing. So remember I said at the outset that the action area controls all three of those things, and by default they're all exactly the same. The action area controls the object image, the documentation highlight, and the control. But if you change them via the property sheet, you can see that the control is actually 22 pixels by 22 pixels. The documentation highlight is 22 by 20, and the object image is 16 by 16. So they're all completely different because I changed them via the property sheet. However, important to note, if I then go and change all of these again by changing the image on the screenshot, say I drop this to 21 by 21, for example, which is different to all of them, now the object image has been reset to be 21 by 21, and the highlight position for the documentation has been reset to 21 by 21, and the control's been changed to be 21 by 21. So all of those things have been reset. So if you change anything via the property sheet, from that point on, do not go and change things on the screenshot, because that will just reset them all again, unless that's specifically what you want. Okay, there's one last thing that I'll point out in all of this, one interesting image. If I go to the string input one that I've got here, you can see that I've got a blank field and I type SU3 into that. So if I generate the document for that, in the document it shows that field filled in with the value. How does it manage to do that? All the screenshots, it always shows them after the string input action has been completed and the fields are filled in, because that looks more informative in a document than just showing a bunch of blank fields. So how does it do that? One last property. Under documentation, you see there is a property called screenshot, and that has in it SU3. This is a little image that it overlays on top of the screenshot only in the documentation, which is why it's in the documentation category. And that's captured to be exactly the same size as the action area again. So it can overlay it quite nicely. Generally, you do not need to change this and never will, but it's nice to know how it's done, because if you re-record stuff and it uses a different font or a different interface, you might need to go and change this. So we're going to do one thing in here just to show that it works the same way as everything else. It is just an image file. You can see that I've got the cursor bar on there. Now I'm going to take that out because if it captures that on each of the screens, it doesn't look very realistic in the documentation. So I'm going to remove that, and I assume you all know how to do this. I'm going to go into the external editor, and I'm going to increase the size of this so I can see what I'm doing. And I'm just going to select that and delete it so it's no longer there. Close that out, save it, save this, and now that's gone. So to prove that this is what it's doing, I'm going to go and generate my document again. And now you can see that the cursor bar has disappeared, which shows that it is in fact using this image here. Okay, so that's it. That's all the interesting little bits of images and things that you need to know about as far as the action areas go and what controls them. So again, if you want to adjust everything, adjust the action area directly on the screenshot. Otherwise, you've got the object image, the documentation highlight position / size, and the control position and size. And you've got the documentation for the input text. You've got under the documentation, you've got the screenshot property, which is used for the overlay on top of the documentation. That's it. I hope you found that useful. Thanks for watching.